Tervehdys kansalaiset ja tervetuloa seuraamme HP Reinventing the Future -tapahtumassa tänään keskustelua 3 suuresta teemasta: kestävä kehitys, elokuvateollisuuden murros ja tietoturva. Päivän lukuisista ja ansiokkaista puhujista toivottakaa tervetulleeksi ensimmäinen Jarkko Huuttaniitty, HP Finland toimitusjohtaja.
Kiitos Jone, ja omasta puolestani myös lämpimästi tervetuloa tähän HP Reinventing the Future 2 -tapahtumaan. Niin kuin Jone tuossa mainitsi, niin meillä on 3 isoa teemaa tässä tänään. Me puhutaan tulevaisuuden teknologioista ja siitä, kuinka ne tulee mullistamaan maailmaa. Me puhutaan vastuullisuudesta ja nimenomaan yritysvastuusta ja yritysten roolista nykypäivän maailmassa. Ja viimeisenä me puhutaan kyberuhista ja kuinka niihin tulisi varautua. HP on tunnetusti innovaattori. Me ollaan yli 80 vuoden olemassaolon aikana tuotu maailmaan paljon erilaisia innovaatioita, jotka on mullistaneet maailmaa. Ehkä parhaiten meidän HP Labsin innovaatiot tunnetaan taskulaskimista tai mustesuihkutulostimista, mutta kuinka moni teistä tietää, että esimerkiksi atomikello, jolla mitataan äärimmäisen tarkasti aikaa, on HP:n tuotekehitysinsinöörien kehittämä tuote? Tai että LED-valaistusteknologia, joka on täysin syrjäyttänyt jo hehkulamput kotien valaistuksessa, on myös meidän labroissa kehitetty. Tänään tuutte kuulemaan yhdessä puheenvuorossa tulevaisuuden teknologioista, joista ollaan äärimmäisen innostuneita. Yksi niistä on niin sanottu mikrofluidistiikka. Aika vaikea sana, mutta mitä se käytännössä tarkoittaa? Se tarkoittaa kykyä liikuttaa mahdottoman pieniä määriä nesteitä hyvin nopeasti ja hyvin tarkasti. Sen käyttömahdollisuudet on lähes rajattomat, mutta erityisesti lääketeollisuudessa, terveydenhuollossa, vaikka diagnostiikassa, mikrofluidistiikalla tulee olla merkittävä rooli. Tuutte kuulemaan tästä vähän lisää hetken kuluttua. Toinen iso teema on vastuullisuus. Me HP:lla ajatellaan sillä lailla, että yksi harkittu ajatus voi muuttaa maailmaa. Me ollaan vuosikymmenten ajan jo tehty meidän omaa vastuullisuustyötä, ollaan yksi maailman vastuullisimmista yrityksistä. Me uskotaan, että yritysten täytyy ottaa tänä päivänä jatkuvasti isompaa roolia maailman polttavien ongelmien ratkaisemisessa, on se sitten ilmastonmuutoksen pysäyttäminen, ihmisoikeudet, monimuotoisuus tai digitaalinen tasa-arvo. Näistä tuutte kuulemaan lisää eri puheenvuoroissa tämän päivän aikana. Digitalisaatio etenee vääjäämättä ja se tulee vaikuttamaan kaikkiin toimialoihin. Se tulee ehkä vaikuttamaan vähän eri aalloissa eri aikoihin. Tänään tullaan puhumaan jonkun verran elokuvateollisuuden murroksesta ja se on meille äärimmäisen läheinen ja mielenkiintoinen alue. Saihan meidän firma aikanaan alkunsa nimenomaan elokuvista. HP:n ensimmäinen asiakas nimittäin oli Walt Disney Studiot. Ollaan vuosikymmenten ajan tehty eri tuotantoyhtiöiden ja elokuvatekijöiden kanssa laajaa yhteistyötä ja yhteiskehittämisen kautta luotu heille sellaisia laitteita ja ratkaisuja, joita he elokuvan tekemisessä tarvitsevat. Meillä on tänään hieno puheenvuoro myös siitä, kuinka tämä teollisuuden ala on mullistuksessa nimenomaan teknologian takia. Viimeisenä aiheena tänään on kyberuhat. Maailma muuttui pysyvästi helmikuun lopussa, kun Venäjä hyökkäsi Ukrainaan. Kyberrikollisuus on tänä päivänä valtiotason rikollisuutta ja heillä on lähes rajattomat resurssit käytössään. Jokaisen ihmisen, jokaisen yrityksen täytyy varustautua tähän ja valmistautua pahimpaan. Meillä on todella kovan luokan asiantuntija täällä puhumassa tänään, kertomassa siitä, mitkä ovat nämä viimeisimmät kyberuhat, mitä he näkevät markkinassa tapahtuvana. Me HP:lla halutaan tarjota maailman tietoturvallisimmat PC:t, päätelaitteet ja tulostimet meidän asiakkaille. Ja onkin hyvä muistaa, ne jotka teistä IT-hankinnoista vastaa, että jokainen IT-hankinta on itse asiassa tietoturvapäätös. Mennään nyt ohjelmassa eteenpäin. Ensimmäisenä saatte kuulla todella mielenkiintoisen esityksen herralta nimeltä Andrew Bolwell. Andrew käyttää titteliä Chief Disruptor täällä HP:llä. Hänellä on aika monta hattua. Hän vastaa muun muassa HP Tech Venturesista, eli meidän rahastosta, joka sijoittaa alkuvaiheen teknologiayrityksiin, mutta hän myös vastaa meidän teknologiavisiosta. Eli hän seuraa laajasti sitä, mitä maailmassa tapahtuu ja miten erilaiset heikot signaalit voivat pikkuhiljaa tulla valtavirtaan ja siten muuttaa maailmaa, ihmisiä, meidän elämää. Mennään katsomaan ja kuuntelemaan Andrew mielenkiintoinen esitys.
Hey, hello everybody and good afternoon. It's great to be here and I'm just really sorry that I can't be here in person. Finland actually has a special place in my heart. My wife is a Finn. She was born there. And in fact, my wife and two daughters have three citizenships, one in the US, one for Australia, where I was born, and of course, one for Finland, where my wife was born. And it's really funny that whenever anybody asks my daughters where they're from, they both say they're from Finland, even though they've never lived there. So I guess I should say I have a Finnish wife and two Finnish daughters. So again, we're just really sorry I can't be there in person. So what I want to talk to you about today is the future and how HP thinks about the future. You know, I think there's just so much change happening around us today that really every company needs to have a systematic way of thinking about the future. And indeed, all of us, everyone in this room, really do need to think like a futurist. Because I really do think that the better that we can think like a futurist, the better we'll be able to create the future that we want. So that's what I'd like to talk with you about today, how to think like a futurist. And probably the best place to start is by talking about change. So I think that it was only just there's just so much change happening around us today that I think we forget how fast things are changing. I mean, even just a few short years ago, I'm wondering if any of us really would have thought that today that we'd be able to travel between cities in minutes on a Hyperloop. Now, the Hyperloop was recently tested in the real world successfully and promises speeds up to 1,000 kilometers an hour, which is faster than a Boeing 747. Or would we have imagined that we would now have flying cars? In Tokyo recently, a flying car co-developed by Toyota made its first maiden voyage. Or would we believe how advanced robots have become? I mean, robots can now do many things, but more and more they're gaining the physical dexterity of human beings as well. As we know, Amazon just launched a series of robots for the home too. So robot advancement is really accelerating as well. And so is the ability for AI to impersonate humans. I love this video clip. Let me play it here. But spoiler alert, this is not Tom Cruise.
I'm going to show you some magic. It's the real thing. I mean, it's all the real thing.
I mean, amazing that that's possible in this day and age. So I guess the big question that confronts all of us with all of this change happening around us is really, how do we deal with all of this change? How do we lead this change and not be led by it? How do we do the disrupting and not be the disrupted? How do we create the future that we want? And I think one of the key ways of doing this is to be constantly on the outlook for new trends that are shaping the world around us and that really do point to where future opportunities lie. Now, of course, if you miss these trends, you are at danger of being disrupted or, worst case, going out of business. And I think the corporate graveyard is littered with companies that didn't react fast enough to the changes going on in the world around them. But if you can catch these trends early and you can figure out how to capitalize on them, I think that's where a source of future opportunity and growth lies. But of course, it's really difficult to catch these trends early. I mean, they don't just appear magically overnight. They start out as very, very small, weak signals that appear gradually. And you really have to be looking for them to notice them. So let's talk about weak signals here for a little bit. What is a weak signal? Well, a weak signal is very early evidence of a potential future mainstream shift. Now, of course, given that they're so gradual in nature, they may or may not ever make that transition. So it's really important to identify them and monitor them over time so that you can catch these new trends early. And catching these new trends early is really critical to staying ahead of the next wave of innovation instead of being left behind by it. So here's a couple that at HP we've been looking at and that we're monitoring over time. For example, Culinary Evolution, which is all about the 3D printing of meat and food, and obviously in the future could impact our diet, but also farming and agriculture. Or the rise of rural, given the shift to remote work now, many people are moving out of cities and into the countryside for the promise of a better life. What will that mean to our businesses in the years ahead? Or the distributed enterprise, for exactly the same reason. Companies can now source the best talent from really anywhere in the world, regardless of location. And people can now work for any company they want, anywhere in the world, in theory. But maybe to give you a better sense of what a weak signal is, I'd like to double click into one of these, something that we call eco-consumerism. Now, eco-consumerism is all about this increasing consumer awareness of how personal consumption impacts the planet. Now, this means that should this come about, people will no longer be willing to buy products that are bad for the planet. They'll only want to buy products that are good for the planet. And what this means for businesses is that they really have to rethink how they design, manufacture, and even sell their products and services in the future. And companies that don't do this, again, are at risk of being left behind. So rather than just being something that's good to do or something that we should do, sustainable practices are really going to become a competitive advantage. And so if this does become a trend, we need to get ahead of that. For example, designing products that use and repurpose waste instead of just increasing waste. Or that after they're used, don't just get thrown into the landfill, but maybe can be composted, or that can naturally break down over time. Or that use renewable energy or resources and energy instead of finite resources. These are all examples of the shifts that will take place if eco-consumerism, easy for you to say, really does take hold. Now, a few weak signals by the numbers, right? Shocking that each of us really does create 5 pounds of waste every single day. Here in the US, 77% of Americans are really concerned about the impact that their choices have on the environment. And so 64% say that they'd rather, pay more than purchase products bad for the environment. So these are numbers that point towards this trend becoming mainstream. And there's also some great weak signal examples. Now, I didn't know this, but concrete's bad for the environment. Concrete tiles are bad for the environment. They really do cause a lot of carbon emissions. So what this innovation has done is it's actually used natural ingredients, invasive species, in fact, weeds and American signal crayfish, which are bad for the environment themselves. And they are using those invasive species to make these ethically made and beautiful biotiles instead, to the point where luxury brands like Louis Vuitton and Dior plan to use these in their interior luxury stores in the future. Or another example, plastic in the shoes that we wear means that they're incredibly difficult to recycle. And mostly shoes that have been used do fill the landfills. So here's an example of a performance shoe created by a company called Zen Running Club that's purely plant-based and vegan. Now, not only are they good enough to eat, but they also biodegrade naturally over time. So no more used shoes in the landfill. Another great example of a product focused on eco-consumerism. And maybe one more, this one from HP. 150 million tons of plastic is produced each year, incredibly bad for the environment. A lot of it is used for packaging. So what HP is doing is using a 3D printing solution to actually allow companies to create molded fiber packaging that will completely replace all of the plastic packaging in use today. And in fact, I'm not sure if you heard, but earlier this year, we also bought a company called Choose Packaging, who've created the first commercially viable, fully plastic-free bottle. It's actually a paper bottle, but don't worry, it's also waterproof. So these are all examples of weak signals that point to this emerging mainstream trend around eco-consumerism. And it's why we have to keep track of weak signals so we can catch these new trends early. Now, another way of doing this, of course, is to be looking at technology as well. I think, as we all know very well, new disruptive technologies can also cause a huge amount of disruption in the world, and are also something that point to future opportunity. So we also keep track of a lot of these types of technologies at HP. For example, quantum computing or 4D printing or blockchain, obviously. Now, I won't have time today to talk with you about many of these, so I just chose a couple that I thought would be of interest. Microfluidics is one of them, and the second is something that we've all been hearing about recently, the metaverse. But let's start with microfluidics. And again, let's start with, well, what is microfluidics? So in short, microfluidics is the ability to work with very, very small amounts of fluid and at great precision. So think about printing as an example. You know, over the last 30 years, HP has really perfected the art of placing very, very small amounts of fluid on very precise locations on a page to create printing. And the technology behind this is microfluidics. Now, just to give you a sense of how small I'm talking about manipulating fluids that are a fifth the size of a human cell and 1,000 times smaller than a raindrop. So we're talking very, very small, thus the name microfluidics. And of course, microfluidics isn't something that is only applied to printing. There's a lot of fluids in the world, including within our own body. And so life sciences and healthcare as well are two really big applications for microfluidics as well. So as an example, and this is probably an example we're all familiar with, you know, if you take a COVID test today, a PCR accurate COVID test, typically you would have a swab taken. You would then need to send that swab into a central lab facility where they would process it and send back the result. This could take days to get a result back. We've all had that experience. But what if we could shrink that expensive central lab equipment into, say, something the size of a phone or something we could put on our desk that all of us could access and own and use in our homes? And that we could test multiple infectious diseases at the same time. So not just COVID, but flu and other infectious diseases as well, and get a result back in 20 minutes, say. That's the power of microfluidics. Or let's take food and water contamination. You know, 1 in 10 people suffer and fall ill from food contamination every year. An incredible number of people, 785 million people, lack access to safe drinking water. But how do they know? Today, these tests for contaminated food and water need to be sent into a central lab facility with very large, expensive equipment, and it takes days to get results back. But again, in a similar way, what if all of us could carry something in our pocket that could, in real time, test whether the food we're eating or the water we're drinking is safe? That's the power of microfluidics. So when I think of microfluidics, I actually think that it's, you know, very similar now to how computing was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we had these huge central mainframe computers that sat in central facilities. And if you wanted to use them, you mailed in punch cards. They got processed and you got your result in days. But then microprocessors changed all of that. I mean, we now have more computing power in our pocket than NASA had in all of 1969 to put the first man on the moon. And today, microfluidics promises to do the same for healthcare and for life sciences, to take that huge, central, expensive lab equipment and shrink it down to a lab on a chip. Something we can all keep in our pocket, something we can all use to get instant disease diagnostics or personalized treatment information. And the beauty of this too is that, unlike computing, it's not going to take 50 years for this to happen. Likely it'll happen within the next 5 years. In fact, it's already happening today. I think the future of microfluidics is already upon us and is going to be with us sooner than we know it. So let's shift streams a little here and talk about the metaverse now. Obviously, this is something that many of us and you know, the press has been talking about pretty actively for the last half a year or so. Now, the metaverse isn't a single technology. It's more a related set of technologies. But I thought it was good to cover here in this section, because I also think that it's the source of a lot of potential disruption moving forward, and something all of us need to be keeping track of. So what is the metaverse? Now, of course, the name metaverse and the concept are not new. They were coined, I guess, nearly 30 years ago by Neil Stephenson in his novel Snow Crash. But I think the short answer is that there is no common definition for the metaverse today. Everyone has their own opinion and their own definition. In fact, it really does remind me a lot of the internet back in the early 90s. Now, for those of you like me who can remember that far back, if you remember then, we used to use this word, the internet, but nobody really knew what it meant. Did it mean AOL? Did it include intranets? And what was this thing called the information superhighway? And I think the metaverse is in the same state today. I think it's really a mood board for the future. Really a future for the internet, more an immersive internet though. So instead of having connected websites that forms the internet of today, we'll have connected virtual worlds, an internet of experiences instead of an internet of content. Now, you might also ask, well, why now? I mean, VR's been around for decades, and Second Life was launched back in 2003, nearly 20 years ago. So why all the fuss and bother now? Well, I think one reason is the fact that last October, Facebook changed their name to Meta and announced they'd spend $10 billion on the metaverse. But maybe more than that, I think it's also that there are 4 technologies that are maturing at the same time and coming together to make this very viable and to really highlight the potential of this moving forward. So maybe just to quickly go through these 4 technologies with you now. The first one is spatial computing. So how we interact with computers is moving from 2D, mouse pointers on screens, to 3D. I mean, this is how we move around in the physical world today. It's how we navigate the real world. And that same experience and that same way of navigating is now coming online and into virtual worlds and computing as well. And it's not just VR and AR and mixed reality. It also includes using your phone to play Fortnite. So that's one, spatial computing. The second one is game engines. Now, game engines are the software tools that developers use to build 3D video games, except that they've also become a lot more sophisticated and are used now in applications in everything from agriculture to enabling the new driver interface in the new all-electric Hummer. So they're not just about video games anymore. I'd say the other thing that we're seeing in game engines is just how realistic they are. I mean, it is literally getting hard to tell the difference between a movie or something in real life and something that was created using one of the latest game engines. Now, the third thing that we're seeing is when you pair spatial computing with game engines, you're getting an explosion of virtual environments as well. Now, these virtual environments just aren't fully made up virtual worlds, but they're also digital replicas of the real world as well. Maybe someday of the whole Earth. And I think looking ahead as companies, today we all have websites. Tomorrow we'll also have a virtual world that we can use to interact with our customers and partners and ecosystems. And I think the fourth technology trend that's coming together to create the metaverse today is something I call virtual economies. Now, in the virtual worlds I talked about earlier, people want to buy stuff. They want to buy clothes for their digital avatars. They want to buy special powers. They want to buy virtual sneakers or digital tools. And they're willing to spend a lot of money purchasing those digital items. I mean, in 2018 and 19, Fortnite generated $9 billion through its virtual economy. But the problem is that when you today buy something in a virtual world, you can't use it in other virtual worlds. And it's not easy, really, to cash it in for cold, hard cash that you can use in the physical world as well. That's where NFTs come in. Now, you've all heard of NFTs. You either love them or hate them, but I think the promise of NFTs is that they allow each and every one of us to own our own digital assets. Something that we buy with an NFT, in theory, can be used across different virtual worlds. And we can sell it later, we can trade it later, we can more easily convert it into cash. So I think NFTs are gaining so much attention because they offer the promise of a pan-metaverse virtual economy. And so that's why I think the metaverse is becoming very, very relevant today, because of the emergence of these four related technologies and technology trends that are really making the metaverse the topic of today, but also potentially the internet of tomorrow. Now, a few examples here, and you may have seen these as well. Nike recently bought a digital agency called Artifact to create virtual sneakers called Crypto Kicks. Now, I think one of the most expensive physical pairs of sneakers you can buy today, around Michael Jordan version, around $1,000. The first virtual version of this Crypto Kick virtual sneaker is on for sale at the moment, and is nearing to $100,000. Each of these virtual sneakers is getting close to $10,000. So this is huge. This is huge for brands. This is huge for companies. And this is why NFTs are also gaining a lot of attention, because they enable this type of virtual economy. Or in basketball and sports, teams on the NBA today are outfitting their physical stadiums with hundreds of video cameras that capture the action in real time and instantly convert that into a metaverse version of the stadium, where people can now go and watch a game and choose any seat in the stadium and watch a game in the metaverse instead of physically, but still get pretty much near exactly the same experience. So these new experiences are being developed and coming out as well. Well, there's companies that are using the metaverse for work. There's companies, in fact, that don't have physical offices, that are using a metaverse version of their digital campus, or a digital campus to interact, to train their employees, to collaborate. I mean, we're doing this as well at HP and trialing this out. And it's still a fair way off in terms of being mainstream, but the weak signals are definitely there that this is coming. Or Meta, as I mentioned earlier, is developing huge new next generation AI supercomputers. And startups are coming into the fray as well. This is a startup that HP Tech Ventures invested in a few years ago. It's a startup that has the first AR contact lens. So now, instead of wearing bulky glasses or using your phone for this, now you can have the metaverse in a contact lens and carry the digital world with you wherever you go in the physical world as well. So these are all examples of weak signal that really do point to the metaverse becoming relevant in the years ahead. So I go back to this question. How do we deal with all of this change, with everything going on? And I'll go back to how I started this presentation. I really do believe that to stay ahead of this change, that we all need to think like a futurist. That being a futurist isn't a role or a job function. Thinking like a futurist is something that all of us need to do, and all of us can do as well, but not many of us do today. In the US, for example, only 35% of people think about their 5-year future on a regular basis. So thinking like a futurist, I think, is a critical part of staying ahead of change. Now, I've talked about monitoring shifts as one way of doing that. Weak signals that point to future trends, or technologies that point to future opportunities. There's a couple of others I'll just mention briefly, although we won't have time to get into them. One is, as a futurist, you really need to have a good sense of what you want in the future, what outcomes you're looking for, what bold goals and vision that you want to put in place. And they need to be bold enough that they cause you to work backwards from those visions in a disruptive way, to think disruptively about how to get there, versus to take today's solutions and then just incrementally improve them over time. So visualizing outcomes is really important. And so is having an open innovation mindset and attitude. I mean, I think success is 95% attitude. This is being okay with failing, from learning from failure, from thinking to think big, to think boldly, to never give up. Really, really important to have the right attitude to stay ahead of all of this change and to create the future that you're looking for. And maybe one final thought, because it's something I think about a lot when I see all of this change happening around us, and we talk about the future a lot, but we really forget that the future hasn't happened yet. The future is something that we all get to create. The future is the result of the choices that we all make today. So maybe I'll just leave you with this thought. Given all that, what future will you create? Thank you so much. And again, wish I could have been there in person and look forward to being there in person next time. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber warfare and cyber threats. And if you haven't met me before, which I guess most of you haven't, it's always interesting. So who is this guy? Why should I listen to him about this topic? So 16 years ago, I founded a cybersecurity firm called Trusted Group. We're about 200 specialists based in Sweden, but we also operate over the world. We have offices in US, Denmark, etc. And we're actually coming to Finland this year after summer. So I'm really excited about being here. I'm going to be here a lot this fall. And it's kind of funny. I mean, I never really meant to be a fairly big organization. It just happened over the years. And have you ever wondered about how did I become what I am today? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Because I do that sometimes. Like, how did I end up here? It could have been anything, right? And it's kind of funny because I know exactly where it came from. When I was 11 years old, I read the book War Games that later became a movie. And I'm 51, so this is 40 years ago. And I felt it was so cool, this dude. He was hacking into NORAD computers and started thermonuclear war, almost, using computers. And I still remember the password, Joshua, because this Falcon dude had a son named Joshua who died at the age of 5, something. So it really influenced me. And the same year, I worked all summer to buy my first computer, which was the Sinclair ZX 81. It had 1K of RAM. You could punch in 1,024 characters before RAM ended. And I actually bought a 16K extra RAM pack and started coding. So that's my background. I've done this all my life. And I kind of knew already then, I'm going to work with computers and hacking. There was no work in hacking at the time, but it appeared later in life. So I'm going to start soft. Some of you guys may know everything about cybersecurity. I assume some of you don't. So what is cybersecurity? Well, if you look at the e-crime economy, like how do you make money being a cyber criminal today? We have some obvious stuff. You can steal money, of course. You can break into computers in banks, etc. You can make monetary transfers. And you can steal data and exfiltrate it, copy it, and use it to compete or something. That's obvious. But some things have changed the last years. And one thing is the ransomware attacks, right? I know you're not hit as hard as most of Europe is, but I think it may be just a matter of time. But in Sweden, we have really big problems with cyber ransomware attacks, where you break into organizations, you encrypt every system in the entire organization, and then you want a ransom for giving them the key to unlock the systems. So that's really horrible. And when you think about it, how can that be possible? How can that be a way of making business? Because availability is so valuable today. Take away computing from basically any organization and they're blind. And I have been in so many investigations, and I've spoken to CEOs or CFOs, etc., on day 0 when this happened, and they called us to do the incident investigation. And they have no way they could ever prepare for this. They have no idea what to do. They are crushed. Their business is on standstill. It's such a new and horrible experience. I've spoken to CEOs who's been thinking like, am I going to have a job a month from now? I have no idea. I didn't have the crisis plans, or I didn't have a strategy. We're just in the dark. I don't even know if my business is going to come back. I can't access a single system. In fact, no one in the organization can email each other. We can't even communicate. We can't even gather the troops right now. We need to check the phones if we have the local phone numbers in our phone book, which we don't because we use Outlook. So it's kind of scary. And then on top of that, you have reputational loss. the threat actors, not only do they break into your systems and encrypt your computers, they're also threatening you and saying, well, if you don't pay, we're not just going to let your computer stay out of function, we're also going to tell the world that you suck. So now you're going to lose your customers because they're not going to trust you. But if you pay, you will not lose your reputation and you will still get back your availability. Fairly good deal, right? And on top of that, we have GDPR and other new rules and laws, legislation. So now it's like, and we will also give this information to the governments. They will fine you for losing your customer private and personal data. So this is the new economy. So they don't just steal money anymore. They don't steal data, or maybe they steal data to threaten reputational loss. We stole your customer database. We're going to release it to the internet, unless you pay us. And this is big business. I'm going to get back to that later. But if you understand this, you understand the ecosystem. And it's not that obvious, because 10 years ago, I was doing these speeches, and some organization said, well, what do we have to do with this? We sell saunas. Just to give you some Finnish example. No, I never had a sauna customer. It just felt cool to say that in front of a Finnish audience. Like if you go down to the reception, the sauna is on floor 6. That's like the first thing. Not like, okay, but where's my room? The sauna is on 6. That's important. Okay, I'll get you. But maybe you even thought that was funny. I think it's really funny, because I do have a sauna in my house, so I have a little bit of like Finnish love. But it's still like, they used to say, okay, we sell saunas, and who would ever break into our organization? Now everyone asks us, okay, so if I'm in this sector, am I more recipient to this threat? Today it depends more on how much are you online, or what is your organizational turnover? Because you're an interesting threat if your business disruption is valuable. What does it cost you to be offline for a week? So it doesn't really have to do with what you sell or what your place in the world is anymore. If you are dependent on computers, someone can take that away from you. And I'll give you one example from last year. I don't know if you read about this. I don't know how big this was in Finland, but it made CNN, etc. Like the Kaseya attack is called, but in Sweden it was the Coop attack, because Coop is a really large grocery chain, food stores. They have like 600-700 stores across the country. And on July 2nd, I remember this, because this is the typical day before the holidays, the summer holidays in Sweden, so it was on the Friday. And I left my son off at the Coop store. He was going to buy some Friday weekend candy. And then he called me on the phone and said, they don't accept my credit card, and he's a teenager. And I'm like, you figured out. Like, come on, don't call daddy all the time, go fix it. And then I went home, and then they called me from Coop and said, we have a problem. Shit, that was a little bit rude to my son. He's not going to be able to fix that yet. But so the Coop attack, it was part of a larger attack. But some threat actors, they breached, or they found a vulnerability in a software called Kaseya VSA, which is used to remote control systems. And it was very popular in the retail industry. So, and they had these servers online, so that if they found vulnerabilities in the servers, they could actually remote control and encrypt thousands of not computers, but organizations. This is the news, but it was updated later. We know that they breached at least 1,500 organizations. One of them was Coop with its 600 stores in one day. That's a big breach. So how did that work? Just to educate you a little bit. So Kaseya is a company in Florida. Small company, they sell, to be honest, not a high quality product, but it's very cheap. And that's good when you sell cash registers to retail, because they want to have, low price solutions for their administration. So what they did was they sold this solution to the point of service providers, the retail cashier providers, and they used it to basically put their Kaseya servers on the internet and then remote control all the cash systems, cash registers across the globe. That's the thing. So any administrator as the service provider could just log on to the online system, and then he could configure all the cash register, update them, change the configuration, etc., run code on the systems. That was the intention of this remote control software. So what Kaseya did, the criminal team are evil. They name themselves nowadays. So the group, the criminal organizations, They're as big as Hells Angels or Bandidos or these big like criminal groups, but these are cyber criminal groups. So they have a name. This group's name is R-Evil. So R-Evil, they downloaded the Kaseya software and they did some analysis on it. And they found a couple of flaws in the software. Some of them were horrible. I know this myself because my team did also analyze the code. But they found 4 vulnerabilities. My team found 10 vulnerabilities in one day in that code. That's widely used across the globe. One of the vulnerabilities was that a password that you can use to log on to any Kaseya VSA server was hard-coded in the code. So all you needed to do was download the code and look at the real code behind the software, which you could easily do if you know what you're doing. So they could basically log on to all the Kaseya servers. I'm simplifying this a little bit, but that's basically what happened. And then they ran code. So they instructed the Kaseya by design, can you please take this software and distribute and run it? This way they could encrypt thousands and thousands of systems in hours. So, and this is a really good thing to understand because they call this a supply chain attack. They actually thought that they breached Kaseya, but they didn't. The threat actors are evil. They just found vulnerabilities in that software. So we need to be mindful of what we're using. That particular incident, 600 stores in Sweden, that was one of the incident response engagement my team did last year. Altogether, we did 174 complex cyber investigations, not only in Sweden, but also in Europe and US. So that was one example out of 174 last year. Most of them related to Swedish organizations, even though many of them are large and international. I know you talked about this psychology organization breach and stuff, but you don't have that many, especially not in the papers, right? Nod or shake your head, so I know if I'm right. Great, thank you for the amazing feedback. I can feel the love. The year before this, we did 34. 2021 was a real increase from 2020. It really took off. We didn't see this coming. We couldn't understand how it could get so much bigger, the impact in our country. In fact, if you look at the cybercrime economy, the US Treasury, they have tracked the 10 largest threat actor groups like the R-Evil group. And by just tracking the money flowing from targeted organization to the payments they're making to the threat actors, which they use Bitcoin to do, and you can track Bitcoin if you just have the address. So they only found a subset of addresses, but they could actually track 5.2 billion US dollars, like 5.2 billion euros approximately, over the course of 3 years. These are 10 teams. So they basically make 500 million, 500 million euros each over the course of 3 years. Can you imagine the business for these groups? And most of these are Russian. I say that for a fact because we track them. We have a department in my business that does this for a living. We currently monitor around 20 threat actor groups from Russia alone. So, and Russia is kind of, it's okay to bang on Russia right now. Before people used to say, why do you always point out Russia? Now it's like, it's okay to point out Russia. They kind of deserve it right now. But some of these people, this is one of the most famous hackers in the world. His name is Maxim Yakubets. And these guys, they move freely in Russia. So they commit cybercrime to the Western world, and it's okay, according to Russia. They usually don't get any trouble for it as long as they stay away from Russian allies or Russian companies and organizations. So, and these guys, you can wonder how they are so untouchable. But this is a good example. This dude, Maxim, who is like a celebrity in Russia. He had a celebrity wedding, he has sports cars, all that stuff. But he's actually married to this girl called Alonya Benderskaya. And Alonya is the daughter of Eduard Bendersky. And Eduard Bendersky is an interesting dude. Not only has he been working for FSB, the security services, like the secret police in Russia, like a high-ranked officer, he was also working in a very, very dangerous unit called Wimpel. The Wimpel part is the one that commits murderers abroad, etc. And what's even more interesting is that this guy, Edward, he's not there anymore. He now have a private company instead. You know what the name is of that private company? Wimpel. Same name as the unit. I don't know how that happened, but they have a security organization that operates internationally, taking care of business if you pay them enough. And he's also a good friend of Putin. They hunt together. He's the highest ranked person in the hunting association of Russia, etc., this dude. So you can imagine this cyber criminal, he's not really afraid. He's a friend of the government. And he's known for some of the most nasty ransomware attacks, softwares, and even financial breaches into banks. The old Carbanak and Fin7 breaches. So he started a team that's suspected to take more than 1 billion from banks in cash over the years. And this is one person. We could do many examples, but he's a good one. Especially if you look at his tasting cars. This is the same dude, just to show you how scared he is of the police. He's just standing talking with a policeman in Moscow there. And if I don't know if can anyone read Cyrillic characters, Russian characters? You can? Can you see there are 3 characters there? It's B-O-P. What's that in? The others are numbers, but there's B first, and then there are 2, 1, 7, there's O-P. So you know what B-O-P means? That's vor. Vor is the word for thief. So on his plate, he says thief. That's when you feel untouchable. His company that he ran was named Evil Corp. This is it true. And just to understand the Russian economy, the tallest building in the entire city of Moscow is a haven for cyber criminals. They have money laundering, they have Bitcoin change companies there, they have basically anything you need in order to run cybercrime operations in the biggest building in Moscow. It's hard to imagine how big this industry is and how untouchable these people have been. So that was an introduction to cybercrime. I'm going to move over to cyber warfare a little bit. And cyber warfare is different. They can steal money, but they can also destroy economies. One example is Ukraine 2017, when Russia sent not a ransomware, but a wiperware, a malware that only destroyed systems that took out 10% of the companies in Ukraine. They just wanted to destroy the economy. They didn't want to make money. They felt like if they don't make any money, we can sell stuff instead of them. Can be even stronger than them. They also take data. They do sabotage. They do propaganda. And they do espionage. So cyber warfare, in the toolbox of a nation state, cyber is just a set of tools that you can use in order to do political or geopolitical campaign or even warfare. So these are just tools. So you don't do propaganda to do propaganda. You do propaganda because you want, for example, scare the Finnish people of joining NATO. So therefore they want you to feel powerless. So maybe if they DDoS all your government agencies, then you will feel powerless and scared, and maybe you won't join NATO. That's the reasoning. So these are just tools. If they can, for example, affect the citizens of a company, they will use propaganda. If they can get the upper hand, they will do espionage. They will install themselves in system. They won't even steal anything. They just want to watch what you're doing. That's different. Sabotage. They want to sabotage stuff to scare you. And in the latest phase in cyber warfare, they will actually sabotage stuff. I'm going to talk about Ukraine. Then they actually break things. So it's a little different. But these are tools as part of planning. No cyber warrior in Russia or any other country will ever do a breach just to do a breach. They will do it because they are serving a higher political purpose. It has to be in a bigger game plan. So these are just tools in a bigger toolbox. And speaking of towers, like the tower, the big money tower in Russia, this is another tower in the outskirts of Russia in a suburb called Khimki. In this place is where the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, have their cyber warriors. So hundreds of people in uniform are sitting in this building every day, breaking into organizations, running sabotage campaigns, espionage, etc. That's what they do. And I have personally investigated GRU campaigns targeting Sweden. people in that building. I have been on computers while they have been on the same computers. So I kind of feel I know them a little bit. So the rest is going to be a little bit talk about Ukraine and how cyber has been affecting Ukraine and what we can learn from that. Since we could potentially have the same threat actor targeting us. It's a great example of learning in real what could happen to a country like Finland or Sweden for that matter. You can see live what's going on in Ukraine. So as you all know, February 24, Russia launched a full-scale assault on Ukraine, an invasion. So let's talk a little bit about what happened prior to that. So I'm going to start from January 11. You could basically start from 2014 when they invaded Crimea, but I'm going to start a little shorter in time because I have 45 minutes. Otherwise, I could go on for a day. But on January 11, 3 of the biggest intelligence organizations in the US put out an advisory to companies saying that we need to be mindful of Russian state-sponsored cyber threats that could target US critical infrastructure. They don't normally do this all together, so this was a joint effort. So they wanted to send a message to the US. Something bad could potentially happen now. And why is this interesting in the context of Ukraine? Well, because 3 days later, Ukrainian government had one severe cyber attack. So it's kind of interesting when you look at this on timeline. The US kind of knew about the fact that something was going to happen. So they may be looking into that tower a little bit in Russia. You can imagine that there is spying going on everywhere. So 2-3 days later, 70 Ukrainian government websites had their web pages changed. And with some nasty messages on them saying all your data is stolen, you will never get it back, and you should be afraid, you should be very afraid, basically. And they didn't say who they were. They actually made some stupid references to other countries than Russia. So some Polish references, basically. But the intent here, going back to cyber warfare, how would you feel if you woke up one day and then you read in the paper that 70 of the Finnish government websites were hacked? Wouldn't that make you feel uncomfortable? Yes, no, just signal. Or talk, that's even better. so that was the feeling of the Ukrainian people. Like someone can take out 70 agencies in the country, 70 government agencies. That's a fairly big number. And it's just graffiti, basically. Just change the web page. At least that's what they felt at the time or knew at the time. And they actually believed that Belarus, White Russia, was behind this attack. And as we all know now, they are very intimate with Russia when it comes to the geopolitical interests. So, a few days later, Ukraine officially blames Russia for this. NATO is saying that they're going to back them up with helping them with cyber to protect themselves, because it's a fairly uncommon pattern that someone has a breach big like this one. And still, this was at the time when tensions were building up. There were already 100,000 soldiers at the border of Russia, or Russia-Ukraine. So, same day, you remember the REvil group, the one that broke into Coop and 1,500 companies? Same day, January 14, this is a little more than a month before the war. REvil, the threat actor group running this Coop incident, they were busted by FSB, the security police in Russia. This has never happened before. Russia don't bust cyber criminals in Russia. I told you, they had a free pass in Russia, right? But they did it, and it's interesting. They didn't do it because they wanted them in jail. They did it to send a message to the US. So if you read the papers, you can see that, they took down REvil, but that was not what they did. This is a propaganda part of a hybrid warfare. They sent a message to the US. If you stay out of our invasion, our future invasion of Ukraine, then we may take away some of your ransomware problems that is really targeting the US. That's what they said. Because, of course, the US have requested for them to arrest these people. They always do that. And this was a big one. 1,500 companies, maybe 1,000 of them were in the US. They took a big hit from this. And as you may know, they took up oil companies and stuff not long ago. A large food chain or food producer in the US. So they have been really affected by Russian cybercrime. But they're also demanding some guarantees here about We do this, but at the same time, they contacted the US and said, please stay away from expanding NATO. We don't want that. So this is negotiation on the headline news without using the word negotiation, just sending messages by taking down threat actors. So, next very interesting thing. The defacement, the web attack on the government websites seemed to be just changing the website. That was not true. They actually installed cyber weapons in these government agencies at the same time. No one knew that at the time because they had sophisticated cyber weapons. This was called Whispergate, which was malware that was looking like ransomware. It looked like it encrypted the systems, but it didn't. It just destroyed them. There were no recovery key. So they basically took out lots of systems in Ukraine. So, and when you analyze that malware, which we also did, you could see that it had resemblances with the NotPetya ransomware that was run by GRU 5 years ago. So you could basically see that this is GRU software. This is not cybercrime. And this is wiperware. And when the similar software used last time, it hit, among others, the Danish company Maersk, who is the largest shipping company in the world. They lost $200 million in that breach. That was the cost of that one single breach. And this is the same attack ran by the GRU that also took out 10% of the computers in Ukraine in 2017. So this GRU team is called Unit 75544, Sandworm. So, moving forward a little bit. US knows this is going to be a problem now. It's escalating. February 4, on the day of the Olympic Games initiation, Russia and China goes out together and says, we have a new relationship, a no-limit relationship. Now we're friends forever. So Xi Jinping and Putin, they're holding hands on the opening ceremony. This will matter a little later. February 15, a big DDoS attack on banks and the defense ministry in Ukraine. This is another interesting thing because this is not sabotage, this is propaganda. The same time they took out the banks, they sent a text message to all the citizens of Ukraine basically that said you cannot get money from your bank. Approximately, that's about what they said. So can you imagine being a Ukrainian husband or wife or something and you get a text message saying basically your money from the bank is gone and then you log on to the bank. At the same time they're doing DDoS attacks to the bank so you can't connect to the bank at all. Can't even go to the webpage. That's kind of scary. In Sweden we have had a lot of DDoS attacks against banks lately. It's like they're testing the same thing. So how could they send a text message to every citizen in Ukraine? Well, they hacked all the government agencies. They have the databases, right? So it's easy. February 15, there is verifications that Russians have broken into critical infrastructures, including military, energy sector, and other critical computer networks. This is 9 days before the war. Attacks were February 21. This is 3 days before the war. We were notified 3 days before the war that war is going to come to Ukraine in approximately 3-4 days from NATO. So NATO knew there was going to be a war. I was talking to one of the guys in the team in Ukraine, CERT, that was helping out with these ransom attacks. So I was personally talking to this guy and I asked him, like, you know war is coming, right? What are you doing now to prepare for this? And he told me, like, Marcus, you don't understand. You're in Sweden. We have been to war with Russia since 2014. But you have 200,000 Russians on your border. Yes, but we've been at war for... The war started long ago. This is no difference. They couldn't really see it coming, in my opinion. Of course, some could, but many of the people, even the ones that were cared about the war, they didn't see it coming. And I'll get back to that. But we knew, and these were phone calls that were made. This was not published anywhere. FBI warns 2 days before the war, people in FBI start to calling companies, CEOs of companies in US, saying you should be prepared for ransomware attacks. They're not publishing this on the internet. They're just making phone calls all day to inform them that war is coming to Ukraine, and we may be hit if we help them out. So, day before the war, big DDoS attack again. So when you have a big DDoS attack, it could be the day before the war. Not just saying, not kind of want you to be super afraid, but we can learn from all this stuff. And February 23, a new really bad destructive malware, wiperware, is hitting Ukrainian networks. It also spreads a little bit to Latvia and Lithuania. And there are some indications that it seems like this was not just Russian people running these attacks a day before the war. It seems like there are indications that it could also, China could also be involved. No limit relationship. So we and many believe that China was also helped. They knew about the war the day before because they were actually conducting attacks to kind of facilitate the war. So February 24, war in Ukraine. This is also interesting. We were helping Ukraine a little bit. And again, they didn't see it coming. And this is so interesting. This is not something I write a lot about, but can you imagine a country having a full-scale invasion, understanding that maybe the country is lost in 2-3 days? That was everyone's assumption at the time. Zelensky was offered to live in exile, to be picked up and sent to the US. So the assumption was that we're going to lose Ukraine in 2-3 days. How digital do you think a country like Ukraine or Finland is today? Where do you think you have all the databases about the people? Are they in computers or are they stored on paper? In computers, right? It's all computers nowadays. So do you think that they store them abroad or do you think they store them in the country? Because you don't want to send all your databases, government databases, to another country, right? That's the big debate. We're not going to send that stuff to the cloud. We want it in our country for security reasons. Now they have another problem. If the country's gone in 2 days, we cannot copy and export all the data in 2 days. There are petabytes of data of all the citizens. Like every detail about who owns what, who is who has a passport, who has a driver license, who is a citizen of the Ukraine. That is in databases. So they were actually afraid of losing all the information about the country as the fabrics of the country. So a large project started, that's not officially, I'm just sharing this, to save the data of the country. Because if they were taken out of Kiev and Russians were to take over, they may never get access to the information about the country again. Can you imagine the scare? And it puts some context into the cloud debate and stuff like that too. Should it be okay to store important data abroad? Well, only if you think that you may ever lose your country. But, you know, we are in a new situation in the world. So it puts things in perspective. They also, and this is a good learning too, on the day of the war, Russia did attacks on communication, including Viasat satellites. So they actually took out satellites. They wanted to destroy communication. You know, one of the most valuable things you can do when you start a war is to disconnect the government of the country from the people. If they cannot communicate, then it's game over. If the president can't talk to the people, then it's game over. So Russia have this plan how to do that. So they knew that maybe we can take out, you know, the phone networks, the government websites and everything. Then they won't be able to communicate. It's so interesting. Their plan was outdated. They didn't realize that you could just go online on YouTube today. You can't take out YouTube as easily as you can take out the country. It's kind of funny. And if you do, then you can go to Facebook instead. And then you can go to Telegram or all the others. So it's really hard to take out the country today, communication. And on top of that, Elon Musk comes in like this dude. Like, you know what? I'll be happy to send some satellite responders to Ukraine to help you. Because I have satellites in the sky. You can use mine. I don't think Putin saw that coming. But it's interesting. We're living in new times. So I'll get back to Zelensky. But many people wondered, like, how come they couldn't take out the internet? How come they couldn't take out the electricity? One, it's not that easy. Two, when you do it, there are alternatives today. Like there are other satellites in the sky, and there are, you know, if you know Elon Musk, you won't have a problem. Unless you know him really well, then you may have problems. But that's a different story. Okay, so same day of the war, other interesting things happened. Anonymous. this group Anonymous, which is just a cause, it's not really a group. You can join Anonymous any day, and then you can commit things for political reasons in the name of Anonymous. So they officially started a war against the Russian government, a cyber war. First time a cyber organization starts a war with a country. Many security people in Sweden, they were like, oh, this is a good thing. I was not one of them. I think in a way it's interesting. And in a way it's interesting that we can use the force of lots of people to do this. But in reality, according to the Geneva Convention, if someone is sitting in Finland and he starts to do cyber attacks on Russia, that could be interpreted as Finland is making war activities on Russia. So this could be an official reason for retaliate with war. So many people didn't understand the world they're stepping into if you start to engage in that. Because if Russia can prove that this is done from Finnish ground by Finnish people, then you're at war, potentially. And the laws about cyber is not really defined, but if you apply that to conventional warfare, that's the case. If a Finnish dude goes from Finland, starts to shooting at Russia, then they have basically declared war. So, but it's interesting still. And then the cyber criminal groups, they responded, since most of them are Russian, this Russian group, and this is Conti, one of the most infamous groups right now, they basically did the opposite. They say, we fully support the Russian government. Remember, they're basically all Russians. And we will strike back at anyone who messes with Russia. So now cyber criminals are interfering with war. Can you imagine? And then, I could see the time there before, I can't anymore. If I can see the time, I won't take too much time, because I could go on forever. I enjoy this. So, when they did this, 2 days later, something happened. The Conti team, who is primarily made out of Russians, they declared war on Ukraine, basically. What they did forget about is that a few members of the Conti team, they are Ukrainians. They forgot about that stuff. So one of the dudes in the Conti criminal group, he felt kind of bad about the fact that his own team was promoting the killing of his own family, or people, if you will. So what he did was, he took all the secrets of Conti and he just put them online. So that was a great learning for us doing threat intelligence. He put the chat logs of all the internal discussions, and you can learn a lot from that. First of all, the Conti team is a couple of 100 people. Just one team alone. And they are built like a company. They have 3 HR managers in that organization that works on recruitment alone. And then they have an ecosystem of people that are outside that organization's hang-arounds in motorcycle world that are also contributing to these cyber breaches. And then you can also see good relationships with government agencies where they help out and they share information. So when they do ransomware and a company steal data, some of the data may go directly to the Russian government. So this has been a great learning. But the cyber criminal organizations in Russia are in turmoil. Zelensky, I know he's looked at as a hero. I think he has been a master at propaganda. Ukraine, which is a way smaller country than Russia, especially when it comes to cyber warfare capabilities, they have completely murdered Russia when it comes to propaganda. And basically Zelensky has done that alone, online. That's pretty impressive. But we can learn a lot from that. Even if you have a company, have backup sites on Facebook, create followers in your customers, LinkedIn, etc. If something happens, you have a ransomware attack, you can still talk to people. What's next? What can we learn from all this? We are a little bit scared that now when Russia is becoming more or less a pariah state, when we don't do business with them anymore and they lose money, that the state agencies of Russia, the GRU and the cyber warriors, if they start to work with e-crime, then they can create a great capability. If they target 1 or 2 countries only with that capability, they could heavily impact the country, taking out hundreds and thousands of organizations in basically days. That's what it could lead to, worst case scenario. And supply chain attacks, if there are, they may also use software that is very popular among many organizations. That's the modus of what they do. If these things are combined, it can be really bad. So those are worst case scenarios. And typical triggers could be the NATO membership application that we are sending in now. We have recently sent in both Sweden and Finland. So if this proceeds, and Russia thinks that they can somehow affect the outcome, I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that Erdogan is blocking this, the Turkish president. Not necessarily, I'm not saying it is either, because I'm not a political expert, but our threat intel people coming from Cygnus Intelligence and other people, they said the typical thing Putin would do now would be make one or two countries to say no. He said that to us before it happened. They want to win time because the Russian cyber machine is really strong, but it's slow. Right now it's targeted to Ukraine. They did not have time to redirect it to Finland and Sweden. But if they gain more months, then they can do it. They may target us instead. That will be impactful. That will be something we have never experienced before. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but they will only do it if they think they can benefit from it. Right now they know they benefit a lot from hurting in Ukraine. So if they think that it could change the outcome of the NATO memberships, then they will. If they don't think they can affect it, then they won't. And the other is, of course, sanctions and the effect of the sanctions. They may start also to use the ransom groups to bring in money to the government. How can I make such a claim when North Korea does this today? So why shouldn't Russia do it the same? They could say 50-50 deal. Go hit the Western world and bring us 50% of the money. That's what Putin does to the oligarchs. So some recommendations going forward. I'm going to run through this very fast. If you don't have a cybersecurity program already, I want to give you just one pointer here. Many people use these NIST assessments. You may have heard about them. You do analysis of your security and then you run them. I would like to stress one thing. Many people do this from left to right. They start with doing asset management and identify what assets they have for 6 months in a program like that. I would say go for detection directly. If you can rapidly detect and isolate an attack, then you have a big win. So if you are to pick one first, it's always going to be detect and respond right now, because a ransomware attack happens in hours. So if you're going to have one cyber capability, it would be detect and respond. Of course, you want to do them all, but if you have to do it in priority, I would go for that. Is cyber insurance big in Finland for large organizations? In Sweden, they're paying out so much money because of all the ransomware attacks, and in the US the same, so that now they're taking one foot out of the ring. They're actually not only increasing the cost of the insurance by 100% last year, for example, but they also say we're just going to cover 50% of the loss, no matter how big or small it is. So even though you have an insurance, they're not going to give you your house back, they're going to give you half your house back. So you're still going to need cybersecurity to minimize the impact of the threat. If an incident occurs, you need to have an incident response SLA with a good incident responder. I don't care who you use. Small company or F-Secure or Nix or the big ones, or hopefully Trusik in the future when we come to Finland. But have a number to call if something happens. It shouldn't be a surprise to you. You shouldn't start to Google for it. You should have an SLA, someone that would come within X hours to start working the case. You should have some kind of crisis management organization set up. Then you will not lose days. It's very valuable when you're affected. And if you ever have a ransomware attack, you will know one thing for sure. You did not have the right backup strategy for ransomware attack. Only after ransomware attack, people have the right strategy. They usually back up all the data. They don't back up all the computers, all the configurations, all the identities. So you need to have a different approach. So go back to your organizations, ask your IT manager or whoever, like, if everything was encrypted tomorrow, what is the backup plan? Do a backup strategy that can cover that. Because if you do, then you can actually go back to business again. You will still have to get the threat actors out, etc., but then you have backups. Then you will never have to pay ransom. When you buy stuff, don't go for the cheap stuff, go for the trusted stuff. A lot of development have been done in Russia lately also. Right now, I would not recommend buying software that is linked to Russia. I wouldn't recommend cloud providers that have support teams in Russia. More common than you think, especially in Finland, since you're neighboring countries. When choosing detection capabilities, don't try to build it yourself, buy it from someone. I'm not saying because I'm selling them. I say this because we do a lot of incident investigations. If you have a fire, call the fire department. Don't try to put it out yourself if it's a big company fire. Use experts when you have a real crisis. It's going to go much better. And, my friend, that's it. Cybercrime is expected to cost lots of money. Depends on who you ask, but this is a big problem, big challenge. And If you want to know more or talk to me about this stuff, you can reach out on LinkedIn, and that's all. Thank you so much for listening.